June 4th, 1942, 10:22 in the morning. Three of the most powerful aircraft carriers the Japanese Empire had ever built were simultaneously on fire, their flight decks torn open, their armed aircraft exploding in chain reactions that no damage control team could stop. A country that had been blindsided by a surprise attack just 6 months earlier had just destroyed the fleet that launched it, and what decided the outcome happened in 5 minutes. To understand how, you have to understand what Japan looked like in the spring of 1942, because the empire that went to war in December 1941 was one of the most formidable military machines the modern world had produced. The Imperial Japanese Navy had spent 2 decades preparing for exactly this kind of conflict, training its pilots to a standard no other navy could match, developing aircraft carriers that were the most capable in the Pacific, and building a doctrine of carrier aviation warfare that other navies were still trying to understand when the shooting started. When those carriers struck Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, they executed one of the most technically demanding operations in naval history with near-perfect precision, attacking from 275 miles away before the United States even knew the war had begun. Pearl Harbor was just the opening move. The same 6 carriers that struck Hawaii ranged across the Pacific and Indian Oceans over the following 6 months, participating in operations that handed Japan control of territory stretching from the borders of India to the Central Pacific. Malaysia fell. Singapore surrendered 130,000 British troops to a Japanese army that attacked overland through jungle the defenders thought was impassable. The Dutch East Indies collapsed. The Philippines fell despite fierce resistance. Burma was overrun, and the carrier force swept into the Indian Ocean and sank 2 British cruisers and a carrier in a raid that sent the Royal Navy retreating to the East African coast. 6 months of war, and Japan had built the largest empire in Asian history at a cost so low it seemed almost impossible. The Japanese military establishment believed they had achieved something permanent, that the speed and scale of their conquests had broken the will of their enemies and established a position no counterattack could dislodge. One man knew better, and that man was the architect of the whole thing. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had spent 2 years studying in the United States and understood American industrial capacity in a way that few Japanese leaders did. Before the war, he told Japan's leadership that 6 months to a year of victories was achievable. But after that, the United States would produce weapons at a rate Japan could never match, and the war would be lost. His famous warning, delivered before Pearl Harbor, described his fear that Japan had only awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve. Yamamoto's solution was to force a decisive naval battle before the sleeping giant fully woke up, and the instrument that gave him a trigger was the Doolittle Raid. On April 18, 1942, F-16 Army B-25 bombers launched from USS Hornet and struck Tokyo and other Japanese cities. The material damage was minimal, but the psychological shock was enormous. Japan's military had guaranteed the emperor that the homeland was untouchable, and suddenly American bombers were over Tokyo. Yamamoto had a response ready. Operation MI, the plan to capture Midway Atoll and use it as bait to lure the American Pacific Fleet into a battle where it would be destroyed by the most powerful naval force Japan had ever assembled. Midway itself was a dot of land measuring 2.4 square miles, sitting roughly 1,100 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor. But its geographic position made it worth fighting over. Controlling Midway let Japan threaten Hawaii, denied American submarines a forward base, and most importantly, Yamamoto calculated that threatening Midway would force the American Pacific Fleet to respond, and when it did, his waiting fleet would destroy it permanently. And the fleet Yamamoto assembled for Operation MI was genuinely staggering in scale. 11 battleships, including Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, whose 18-inch guns hurled shells weighing more than a car over 25 miles. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, carrying 248 aircraft, flown by the most experienced naval aviators in the world, the same men who had attacked Pearl Harbor and spent 6 months winning every engagement they entered. 21 cruisers, 65 destroyers, 19 submarines, and dozens of support vessels carrying the invasion force that would occupy Midway once the American fleet was eliminated. More than 200 ships committed to a single operation. And that's when the plan ran into a problem Yamamoto had no way of knowing about, because it was sitting in a basement. The basement beneath the 14th Naval District headquarters at Pearl Harbor housed a unit called Station HYPO under Commander Joseph Rochefort, one of the most unusual officers in the United States Navy, a man known for working in a bathrobe and slippers because he spent so little time away from his post that formal uniform requirements had become impractical. Rochefort had assembled a team of cryptanalysts and linguists working around the clock in shifts, sleeping on cots, eating at their desks, reading messages the Japanese were convinced no foreign intelligence service could decode. In early 1942, that team had broken JN-25B, Japan's primary naval operational code, not completely, but enough to understand the shape of what was being planned. What they were reading described a massive operation targeting a location coded as AF, and Rochefort was certain AF meant Midway. Washington's rival intelligence office disagreed, arguing for Alaska or the American West Coast. The internal dispute threatened the entire defensive response, because if Nimitz sent his carriers to defend Midway while Japan actually struck Alaska, the carriers would be in the wrong place when it mattered most. Captain Wilfred Holmes gave Rochefort the tool to settle it. Station HYPO contacted the Midway garrison through a secure undersea cable the Japanese couldn't intercept, and told them to broadcast a plain language message reporting that the island's freshwater distillation equipment had broken down. Within days, a Japanese intelligence summary arrived confirming that AF had a freshwater problem. When Washington stopped arguing, AF was Midway, the date was June 4th or 5th, and the trap could be set. Admiral Chester Nimitz received Rochefort's intelligence and made the decision that separated great commanders from good ones. 3 carriers were available: Enterprise, Hornet, and the badly damaged Yorktown, which Pearl Harbor's repair crews had estimated would need 90 days to fix. Nimitz overrode the estimate and told his workers he needed her back in 72 hours. 1,400 workers swarmed the ship in dry dock, welding over damaged sections without removing the underlying material, making temporary repairs no peacetime inspection would accept. And 48 hours later, Yorktown steamed back out to sea with her air group embarked. Japanese intelligence believed only 2 American carriers were available. They were wrong by exactly 1, and that miscalculation would cost them 4 of their own. Nimitz sent all 3 carriers to an imaginary point northeast of Midway called Point Luck, where they arrived by June 2nd and sat waiting, while the largest Japanese fleet ever assembled sailed toward them from the west. Yamamoto was aboard Yamato 300 miles behind his carriers, maintaining radio silence to protect his position, entirely unaware that the Americans he planned to surprise were already in place. The trap had been set by the people who were supposed to be caught in it. No windows, poor ventilation, the constant hum of IBM tabulating machines processing intercepted Japanese signals, and a commander who hadn't slept in a real bed for weeks, running the whole operation in a bathrobe because changing clothes had become a luxury he couldn't justify. Station HYPO's basement at Pearl Harbor was not a glamorous place to fight a war, but what Rochefort's team accomplished there did more to win the Battle of Midway than anything that happened in the air or on the water. JN-25B, Japan's primary naval operational code, had been designed with complete confidence that no foreign intelligence service could read it in real time, and the Japanese weren't entirely wrong about how hard it was. Breaking JN-25B wasn't like finding a key and unlocking a door. Thousands of jigsaw puzzle pieces arrived daily from dozens of different puzzles mixed together, with no picture on the box. And Rochefort's team had to identify which pieces connected and what image they formed before the moment they depicted had already passed. Working in shifts around the clock, sleeping on cots in the basement, eating at their stations, these analysts had built a cumulative understanding of Japanese naval communications that went beyond pure cryptanalysis into something closer to intuition. Rochefort himself had spent years studying Japan before the war, spoke the language, understood the culture, and had developed a feel for how Japanese naval commanders thought that let him fill the gaps. Mathematics couldn't close. When a decoded message had holes, Rochefort filled them with context accumulated over years of study. And he was right often enough that Nimitz had learned to trust his assessments over the more conservative analysts in Washington. By spring 1942, the intercepts told a clear story. Radio traffic between Japanese naval commands had increased dramatically. New operational code words kept appearing. Supply requisitions on a massive scale were being processed, and ships were being pulled from other assignments and consolidated into formations larger than anything seen before. The shape of Operation M. I emerged from the intelligence picture before the details filled in, and what the shape suggested was a force larger than anything Japan had yet committed to a single objective. The designation AF appeared repeatedly in the most sensitive traffic, always tied to the largest force concentrations and the highest priority planning. Rochefort and Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, the Pacific Fleet's intelligence officer, studied every AF reference and became increasingly certain the designation covered Midway. The geography made sense, the strategic logic made sense, and the timing matched what they knew about Japanese planning cycles. What they lacked was proof that would end the argument with Washington. Washington's OP-20G, the Navy Department's rival intelligence office, pushed back on his assessment, arguing for Alaska or possibly the American West Coast. The disagreement had an institutional dimension that went beyond pure analysis, a friction between Rochefort's field-based approach and Washington's more hierarchical intelligence establishment, and it threatened the entire defensive response, because if Nimitz committed his carriers to the wrong location, or Japan would encounter no serious opposition at the real target, Rochefort needed to resolve it before Nimitz had to move his forces, and Captain Wilfred Holmes devised the solution. Holmes's ruse exploited the very communications network Japan used to confirm intelligence about its targets. Station HYPO contacted the Midway garrison through a secure undersea cable, instructed them to broadcast a plain language message reporting that the island's freshwater distillation equipment had broken down, and then tuned every available receiver toward Japanese frequencies and waited. Within days, a Japanese intelligence summary arrived, decoded through JN-25B, reporting that AF had a fresh water problem. The specific detail of water shortage appeared in a report about AF at exactly the moment the Midway garrison had broadcast their false emergency. And the coincidence was too precise to be a coincidence. Washington stopped arguing. AF was Midway. Rochefort was right. And what Station HYPO had built from weeks of painstaking analysis gave Nimitz something no naval commander in history had possessed in quite this form: the enemy's battle plan before the enemy executed it. The attack date was June 4th or 5th. The direction of the carrier strike would come from the northwest. The first air attack against Midway would launch around 0600, and the specific carriers committed to the operation were Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, forming the Codebreakers strike force under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. When the battle was over, Nimitz told Layton with a smile that his pre-battle assessment had been only 5 minutes, 5 degrees, and 5 miles out from actual Japanese positions. And that's a level of intelligence accuracy that had no real parallel in the history of naval combat, and that transformed what should have been a catastrophic mismatch into something approaching an even fight. None of it mattered, though, without solving the Yorktown problem. USS Yorktown had fought at the Battle of Coral Sea in early May 1942, where American forces stopped Japan's invasion of Port Moresby at the cost of USS Lexington, sunk by torpedo and bomb damage that proved impossible to control. Yorktown survived, but barely, taking 3 bomb hits that started fires burning for hours, causing flooding in several compartments, and leaving her listing visibly when she limped back toward Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor's damage assessment team delivered their professional judgment: 90 days of repair work before Yorktown could fight again. The structural damage alone required cutting away compromised steel and welding in replacement sections, a process that couldn't be shortened without risking the ship's integrity. 90 days was not a pessimistic estimate. It was an honest one from experienced people who understood what they were looking at. Nimitz told his repair crews he needed the ship back in 72 hours, and 1,400 workers descended on Yorktown in dry dock almost immediately. 3 shifts around the clock, welding over damaged sections without removing the underlying compromised material, making temporary repairs no peacetime inspector would accept, installing replacement equipment close enough to specification to function even if it wasn't exactly right. 48 hours later, and a Yorktown steamed back out of Pearl Harbor with a full air group embarked, her weapon systems functioning, her flight deck operational, carrying repairs that would hold through a battle even if they wouldn't survive a full inspection. To Japanese intelligence, which believed Coral Sea damage had put her out of action for months, Yorktown didn't exist. Their battle plan assumed 2 American carriers, and that miscalculation in carrier arithmetic would prove decisive in ways neither side could predict when the fleets sailed toward each other across a Pacific that looked the same in every direction. Task Force 16, built around Enterprise and Hornet under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, and Task Force 17, built around Yorktown under Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher, who held overall command of both task forces. Now arrived at Point Luck northeast of Midway by June 2nd, sitting on a featureless ocean. 2 days before, Japanese forces expected any American ships in that part of the Pacific. Yamamoto's submarines, supposed to form a detection line between Hawaii and Midway and report American carrier movements, arrived 2 days late. The carriers had already sailed through the position where the picket line would eventually be established, and Yamamoto had no idea his early warning system had been irrelevant before it was even in place. June 3rd brought confirmation of everything Rochefort had predicted. A PBY Catalina patrol aircraft spotted the Japanese invasion transport force 700 miles southwest of Midway, confirming that the battle was coming and that the timing was accurate. B-17 Iwas from Midway attacked the transports throughout the day and achieved essentially nothing against maneuvering ships in open ocean, which was disappointing but not surprising. The real battle was still 12 hours away, and it would begin the following morning when Nagumo turned his carriers into the wind northwest of Midway before dawn and started launching aircraft. He believed he was sailing toward a surprise attack against an unprepared target, and the Americans waiting northeast of him had read his orders before he executed them. June 4th, 1942, began at 0430 when Nagumo turned his 4 carriers into the wind and started sending aircraft into the darkness. 108 planes rose from the flight decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, dive bombers and torpedo bombers with 0 fighters to escort them, led by Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, whose mission was to neutralize Midway's airfields and defenses so completely that the island garrison couldn't threaten the invasion force arriving the following day. Half of Nagumo's aircraft stayed on the hangar decks. Standard Japanese carrier doctrine required holding a reserve strike force armed and ready for American warships, because the whole purpose of Operation MI was destroying the American fleet, and if U.S. carriers appeared while every Japanese plane was committed against Midway, Nagumo would have nothing to respond with. The reserve aircraft sat armed with anti-ship torpedoes, fully fueled, waiting for the order that would never come in the form Nagumo expected. Midway's radar picked up the incoming strike at 0553, while Japanese aircraft were still 93 miles out, and every flyable plane on the island scrambled to get airborne before bombs could catch them on the ground. 26 Wildcat and Buffalo fighters rose to intercept, and what followed was a brutal mismatch. Japanese Zero pilots were veterans of years of fighting in China and 6 months of continuous Pacific combat, flying an aircraft faster and more maneuverable than anything the Midway defenders had, and surviving Marine pilots later described the engagement as fighting a superior force with no real answer for what it was doing to them. 17 American fighters were shot down against minimal Japanese losses. Tominaga's bombers struck the island between 0630 and 0650, and the results were significant but incomplete. Oil tanks on Sand Island erupted in fire, visible from miles away. The seaplane hangar burned, the powerhouse took hits, and buildings across both islands were damaged or destroyed. Director John Ford, present as a Navy Reserve commander to film the battle, took shrapnel wounds while shooting footage at the power plant, his camera shaking with the blasts around him. But Midway's runways remained operational. The fuel supplies survived mostly intact, the radar installation kept functioning, and the garrison could still launch aircraft. Tominaga assessed the situation honestly and radioed back. There was need for a second attack wave. that Midway hadn't been neutralized, and that message, arriving on Akagi's bridge at 07:15, triggered the first link in a chain of decisions that would end with 4 Japanese carriers on the bottom of the Pacific before the day was out. Nagumo ordered his reserve aircraft rearmed from anti-ship torpedoes to general-purpose bombs for hitting land targets, and crews on the hangar decks began the laborious process of removing torpedoes and replacing them with bombs, a procedure taking trained men under good conditions at least an hour to complete. 13 minutes into that process, a float plane from the cruiser Tone reported contact with American surface ships to the northeast. The Tone float plane had launched 30 minutes late due to a catapult malfunction, and those 30 minutes had compressed Nagumo's decision window at the worst possible moment in the entire battle. The initial contact report was vague, giving a position and a ship count, but no identification of type. Nagumo asked for clarification, and at 07:45, the Tone plane amended its report. What appeared to be a carrier bringing up the rear. A carrier, the one type of ship that justified keeping the torpedo-armed reserve in the first place, had appeared at the exact moment those torpedoes were lying on hangar decks being replaced with bombs. Nagumo ordered the rearming stopped and reversed, which meant crews who had spent 30 minutes removing torpedoes now had to put them back, working in cramped or fuel-soaked hangar spaces under time pressure that kept increasing as waves of Midway-based aircraft continued attacking the fleet throughout the morning. Army B-17S from high altitude, Marine dive bombers at medium altitude, torpedo-carrying B-26 Marauders at low level, all attacking throughout the morning and all failing to score meaningful hits against maneuvering Japanese ships, but each attack forcing the carriers to take evasive action and disrupting the rearming process further. The weapons that weren't on aircraft stacked up on hangar decks rather than being stowed in magazines below, because there wasn't time to move everything correctly before each new order came. Torpedoes sat in passageways, bombs removed during the first rearming sat in piles where they'd been left. Make and aviation fuel ran through hoses that stayed connected between cycles. The Kido Butai had turned itself into a floating ammunition dump at exactly the moment American aircraft were circling overhead, looking for a way in. What none of the Midway-based attackers could see, and what would change everything, was happening above the fleet. Zero fighters from all 4 carriers had been responding to American attacks since 0700, wave after wave pulling fighters down from altitude to sea level, where the engagements were happening, and 2 hours of continuous combat air patrol had left many Zero pilots low on fuel, low on ammunition, and nowhere near the altitude needed to intercept a high-level dive-bombing attack. The aerial umbrella protecting the Japanese carriers had frayed, its pilots strung out between sea level and medium altitude, all focused entirely on threats coming from the direction of Midway. Nobody was looking up. Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron, a South Dakota-born naval aviator who had been flying since 1927, understood exactly what he was being asked to do when he led Torpedo Squadron 8's 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers off Hornet's deck at 0702. The Devastator had been considered modern when it entered service in 1937 and was dangerously obsolete by 1942. Slow enough that Japanese Zeros could engage it almost at walking pace, with a torpedo delivery system requiring the pilot to approach within a few hundred yards of the target at low altitude and low speed before releasing. Waldron had begged for fighter escort before launch. All had been denied by Hornet's Air Group commander, Commander Stanhope Ring, who kept the fighters with the dive bombers at high altitude and departed, knowing his 15 planes had no protection against what was waiting for them. Ring took his dive bombers and fighters on a heading of 265 degrees, which was wrong. The Japanese carriers sat at roughly 240 degrees from Hornet's position, and Ring's incorrect heading took his groups away from the enemy rather than toward them. Waldron broke away from Ring's formation almost immediately, following his own calculations in a slightly different direction, and the result was that Torpedo Squadron 8 found the Japanese fleet when better-equipped groups didn't. His last transmission to his men before the attack carried the weight of a man who knew what was coming. "We will strike regardless of the consequences." The consequences arrived immediately. Zero fighters peeled away from the combat air patrol and dove toward the slow-moving Devastators coming in at low altitude, and the planes started falling one by one. The attack never achieved coordination, the approach had no protection, and the torpedoes themselves had reliability problems that meant even the few that reached release point often ran erratically or failed to detonate. Plane after plane was hit, some exploding when fuel tanks ignited, some spiraling into the sea with the crew still fighting controls that no longer responded, some managing to release their torpedoes before the end without ever threatening a Japanese ship. All 15 Devastators were shot down. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise followed VT-8 into the same killing ground and suffered devastating losses. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown came in third and was torn apart by the same defenses. Between the three torpedo squadrons, 41 planes had attacked the Japanese fleet. 35 were shot down, and not one torpedo found its target. The sole survivor from Hornet's VT-8 was Ensign George Gay, 22 years old, from Waco, Texas, shot down after releasing his torpedo, surviving the crash into the Pacific and keeping himself alive by holding a black rubber seat cushion over his face whenever Japanese ships passed close enough to spot him. Every zero above the Codebreakers had descended to sea level to kill torpedo bombers, and the hours of attacking Midway-based planes and 3 carrier-based torpedo squadrons had exhausted the Japanese fighter pilots, and many were now low on fuel and ammunition and altitude, focused entirely downward and outward on the low-level threats that had been coming all morning. Nobody, from the highest altitude Zero pilot to the lookouts on the carrier bridges, was scanning the sky directly above. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey arrived at the anticipated Japanese position at 0920 with 35 SBD Dauntless dive bombers and found nothing. The SBD Dauntless was everything the Devastator wasn't: a capable aircraft with a reliable engine and the ability to dive at steep angles and deliver bombs with accuracy that high-altitude horizontal bombers could never match. And if McCluskey's pilots found the Japanese carriers, they had a real chance of doing serious damage. The problem was that the ocean below them was empty. Every minute of searching burned irreplaceable fuel, pushing more planes past the point where they could reach a target and still return to Enterprise. And at some threshold, the math would make finding the fleet irrelevant because there wouldn't be enough fuel to matter. Logic said, turn back, preserve the aircraft, preserve the pilots, fight another day with assets that still existed. McCluskey scanned the ocean below and saw a single destroyer running at high speed toward the north, leaving a white wake across the blue water. That destroyer was Arashi, which had spent the previous hour chasing submarine USS Nautilus after Nautilus attacked the Japanese fleet and dove to evade, and was now racing north to rejoin the formation her detachment had left behind. Her wake pointed like an arrow toward the position of the Japanese carriers, and McCluskey turned and followed it. Nimitz would later say that decision decided the fate of our carrier task force and our forces at Midway. And he was right, though it was made not by a strategic genius executing a calculated plan, but by a converted fighter pilot running on instinct and fuel fumes over a featureless ocean. What lay at the end of that wake was the entire Codebreakers, 4 carriers in the middle of chaotic rearming operations, their fighter screen at sea level burning the last of its fuel, their hangar decks stacked with weapons in the wrong places, and no radar on any Japanese ship to warn them that dive bombers were approaching from directly above. At 10:22, McCluskey's 2 Enterprise bombing squadrons arrived overhead the Japanese carriers, and Yorktown's dive bombing squadron, under Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, arrived from a slightly different angle at almost the same moment. 3 American groups converging on the same targets within minutes of each other, in a coincidence of timing that no amount of planning had produced. Below them, Akagi and Kaga sat in one cluster with Soryu off to one side, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being repositioned, their hangar decks stacked with weapons that were in completely the wrong place at the worst possible time. McCluskey split his force, Gallagher's squadron to Kaga, Best's squadron to Akagi, while Yorktown's bombers were already rolling into their dives towards Soryu. Pilots pushed over from altitudes between 14,000 and 20,000 feet, the Dauntlesses accelerating as they dropped, pilots holding their dives as long as they dared, before releasing and pulling out with forces that grayed their vision and drove them down into their seats. Kaga took 4 direct hits in rapid succession, bombs crashing through the flight deck into the hangar where armed aircraft and stored weapons generated a sequence of explosions that damage control had no answer for within 30 seconds. Akagi took 2 direct hits that found the same conditions: armed aircraft on the hangar deck, fuel hoses still connected, bombs and torpedoes improperly stored because there hadn't been time to move them before the attack arrived. Soryu took 3 direct hits and was engulfed in fire so quickly that survivors described the entire visible length of the ship burning at once. From the moment McCluskey's lead aircraft began its dive to the moment 3 carriers were mortally wounded, approximately 5 minutes passed. Not 5 hours, not 5 days, 5 minutes. And the most powerful carrier striking force Japan had ever assembled, the fleet that had ranged undefeated across 2 oceans for 6 months, had been destroyed in the time it takes to brew a cup of coffee. George Gay, floating in the Pacific 3 miles from the nearest Japanese ship, his black seat cushion held over his white face, watched all 3 carriers burning from the water. The last man alive from Torpedo Squadron 8, the squadron whose deaths had pulled the Japanese fighters to sea level and cleared the sky for the dive bombers, had a front row seat to the result of what his squadron had done. Oh, he would float there for another 7 hours before a PBY Catalina found him the next morning, watching through the afternoon as a 4th carrier burned on the horizon and the greatest naval battle in Pacific history played out around him. Hiryu had survived the initial strike, positioned far enough from the other 3 carriers that McCluskey's and Leslie's dive bombers focused on the closer targets. Her commander, Captain Tomeo Kaku, and the aggressive Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi didn't wait for orders. At 1100, Hiryu launched 18 dive bombers against the American fleet, found Yorktown, and put 3 bomb hits into her in quick succession, starting fires and knocking out boilers and leaving the carrier dead in the water, with a developing list and black smoke rising from her flight deck visible for 20 miles. Yorktown's crew fought the damage with the same ferocity that characterized every other moment of the battle, and within 2 hours damage control teams had performed what seemed like another miracle, restoring power, correcting the list, and getting the ship back to 20 knots. At 14:30, Hiryu launched again, 10 torpedo bombers this time, and 2 torpedoes found Yorktown's hull, flooding that couldn't be controlled, forcing the abandoned ship order for the 2nd time in 3 hours. But Hiryu was already finished. American search aircraft had located her, and at 1724, SBD Dauntlesses from Enterprise rolled into their dives over the last Japanese carrier. 4 direct hits left Hiryu burning with fires that couldn't be fought, and by 02:30 on June 5th, as Captain Kaku and Rear Admiral Yamaguchi made the decision Japanese naval tradition demanded. They chose to go down with their ship, and Hiryu sank with them aboard as the night watch changed on the vessels around her. All 4 carriers were gone. The battle's decisive action was complete. News of the burning carriers reached Yamamoto aboard Yamato in fragments across the afternoon of June 4th, each message worse than the last. Assembled by a man 300 miles behind his fleet who had to piece together what was actually happening from reports filed by people under attack who could only describe what they could see from where they were standing. What emerged from those fragments was a disaster of a magnitude that Japanese naval planning hadn't conceived as a realistic possibility when Operation MI was drawn up. 3 carriers burning and beyond saving, then a 4th. The Kido Butai, the striking force that had been the offensive core of Japanese naval power since December 1941, the fleet that had ranged across 2 oceans without suffering a serious defeat. A had been destroyed in a single afternoon by an enemy it was supposed to outmatch in every category that mattered. Yamamoto's first instinct was to continue. Surface ships still existed. Japanese night fighting techniques were genuinely superior to American ones, and heavy cruisers and destroyers operating in darkness didn't need air cover the way they needed it in daylight. Briefly, he considered ordering his surface ships forward to engage the American fleet after dark, absorbing whatever air attacks came during the remaining daylight, and then using the night to destroy American carriers with torpedo salvos in the close-range engagement his surface fleet had trained for throughout its existence. The math killed the idea before it could become a plan. Without air cover at dawn on June 5th, and his surface ships would face American carrier aircraft in conditions identical to the morning of June 4th, with different targets but the same outcome. Battleships had no answer for dive bombers attacking from altitude, with the accuracy the dauntless pilots had demonstrated that afternoon, and sending the surface fleet forward was sending it to be sunk in a slower and more expensive version of the same disaster. At 02:55 on June 5th, Yamamoto ordered a full retreat. The first time in the Pacific War, a Japanese fleet had turned away from an engagement without forcing a conclusion. The retreat didn't end the fighting because Yorktown was still out there, damaged and fighting, and Japanese submarines that had been useless at detecting American carriers before the battle remained dangerous to individual ships in the aftermath. Our June 5th brought a salvage operation that should have saved the carrier. Minesweeper USS Vireo took her under tow. The crew returned aboard, and damage control teams resumed work on the flooding and structural damage two separate attacks had inflicted. From a distance she looked wounded but survivable, a ship that had already beaten odds no one had given her any business beating. Japanese submarine the B-168 had been ordered to finish Yorktown if carrier attacks hadn't done so, and her commander found the damaged carrier on June 6th surrounded by destroyers but open to a submarine approaching carefully from the right angle. 4 torpedoes left the tubes, 1 missed. 1 struck the destroyer USS Hammond, positioned alongside Yorktown, providing electrical power and firefighting support through hoses connected directly to the carrier's hull. Dawes and Hammond broke in half and sank in minutes, taking most of her crew. 2 more torpedoes struck Yorktown, and the flooding that followed was beyond what the remaining damage control teams could manage with what they had. Yorktown survived through the night of June 6th in defiance of any reasonable expectation, listing heavily, visibly dying, but refusing to go under, until the list became too extreme to work safely aboard and the last salvage teams had to leave. At 0500 on June 7th, 3 days after the battle had started and 24 hours after the submarine attack that should have finished her quickly, USS Yorktown capsized and slipped beneath the Pacific to a depth of 16,650 feet. Robert Ballard found her in May 1998. Her original paint scheme and deck markings still visible on a ship that looked like it had been carefully lowered to the bottom rather than sunk in combat. The final accounting was asymmetric in ways that no battle plan on either side had anticipated. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, all 4 of the carriers that had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack, gone in less than 24 hours. The heavy cruiser Mikuma was sunk by American dive bombers on June 6th while withdrawing with damage from a collision during evasive maneuvers. 3,057 Japanese personnel died, including a concentration of experienced naval aviators whose collective skill represented years of training and combat experience accumulated across multiple theaters. 362 Americans died. The United States lost Yorktown, the destroyer Hammond, and 144 aircraft. The carrier exchange of 4-1 told the immediate strategic story clearly enough, but the numbers that mattered most weren't the ships. Japan's naval air arm had spent years training the aviators who died at Midway, and these were not men who could be replaced on any reasonable timeline. Producing a truly skilled carrier pilot required time, instruction, flight hours, and combat experience that couldn't be shortened without degrading the result. And the men who died defending the Kido Butai on June 4th represented an accumulation of institutional knowledge that Japan's training pipeline couldn't regenerate in months or years. America was losing pilots too, men irreplaceable on a personal level. But American flight schools were expanding throughout 1942 and producing new aviators at a rate the Japanese system couldn't match. American shipyards were building Essex-class fleet carriers at a pace that would give the United States more carrier tonnage in 1944 than Japan had ever possessed at its peak. The battle of attrition Yamamoto had feared before Pearl Harbor, the grinding industrial competition Japan's leadership knew they couldn't win, if given enough time, had effectively begun the moment Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu started burning northwest of Midway. Yamamoto understood this. He had predicted it before the war started, had structured his entire strategic approach around avoiding exactly this outcome, and watched it happen anyway. Bomb fleet dispersal that seemed logical as a way to threaten multiple objectives simultaneously had instead ensured his various groups couldn't support each other when the decisive moment came, and his 4 carriers had fought alone against American carriers he didn't know were there, 3 of them destroyed before they could launch a single aircraft in response. The intelligence failure underpinning everything else was the greatest miscalculation. Japan sailed into Midway believing in the security of its communications, convinced that JN-25B couldn't be read in real time by foreign analysts, and that belief had been fatal. Rochefort's team hadn't broken every message perfectly, but they'd broken enough to give Nimitz the information he needed, and the freshwater ruse had confirmed it with a precision that left no room for argument. Nagumo's rearming decision haunted the post-battle analysis on both sides. Twice reversed rearming had left bombs and torpedoes on hangar decks rather than properly stowed in magazines, and a bomb penetrating into a hangar full of armed aircraft, unattached torpedoes, and live bombs stacked next to fueled planes creates a disaster that propagates through a ship in seconds, rather than the serious but manageable damage caused by the same bomb penetrating an organized, properly stowed hangar. Nagumo had been responding to real tactical pressures with each decision he made, but the cumulative result left his carriers maximally vulnerable at the moment of American attack. Japanese carriers also lacked radar. Every American carrier at Midway carried a CXAM radar installation, providing early warning of incoming aircraft, and giving time to launch fighters and position them to intercept before attackers arrived overhead. Japanese carriers relied on lookouts and combat air patrol, a system that worked adequately against attacks from expected directions, but failed completely against the simultaneous arrival of multiple dive bombing groups from different directions and high altitude. The American pilots who rolled into their dives at 10:22 achieved complete surprise not because the Japanese were careless, but because the detection systems defending those carriers had no way to find a threat approaching from directly above. Joseph Rochefort's treatment in the aftermath of Midway carried its own sharp injustice. Nimitz recommended him for the Distinguished Service Medal immediately after the battle, acknowledging that the intelligence work at Station HYPO had been as decisive as anything that happened in the air or on the water. Washington denied the recommendation. The rivalry between Station HYPO and OP-20G hadn't been resolved by Rochefort being proven right. Being proven right had sharpened the institutional resentment toward him, and in the bureaucratic politics that continued even during wartime, OP-20G arranged his removal from Station HYPO in October 1942. The man who had read Yamamoto's battle plan before Yamamoto executed it spent the rest of the war in minor administrative assignments, and the Distinguished Service Medal Nimitz recommended in 1942 was awarded posthumously in 1985. 43 years after Midway. Rochefort had died in 1976 without receiving it. George Gay spent 30 hours in the Pacific before a PBY Catalina found him on the morning of June 5th and brought him to safety, having floated through the afternoon and night of June 4th, watching carriers burn and sink, watching Japanese ships pass close enough that he had to cover his face to avoid being spotted, experiencing the most consequential naval battle of the 20th century from a vantage point that no historian could replicate. He arrived at Pearl Harbor 24 pounds lighter than when he'd left, the only man who had been inside the battle from beginning to end, and lived to describe it from the water. 60 days separated the end of the Battle of Midway from the beginning of the American counteroffensive at Guadalcanal, and that compression tells you something important about what Midway actually decided. On June 4, 1942, the United States was 6 months into a war it hadn't started, fighting with carriers it had barely kept in service, reading an enemy's communications from a basement, and winning by margins so narrow that a 30-minute catapult delay on a Japanese cruiser's float plane nearly changed everything. On August 7, 1942, American Marines landed on Guadalcanal and started the offensive campaign that didn't stop until Japan surrendered 3 years later. Nothing in between those two dates changed the fundamental balance of industrial and military power between the two countries. And America didn't build new carriers in 60 days, the training pipeline didn't produce replacement pilots in 2 months, and the strategic situation didn't transform overnight from desperate to comfortable. What changed was the direction of travel, the trajectory the war followed, and the understanding on both sides that Japan's period of unchallenged Pacific dominance had ended at Midway and would not resume. Before June 4, 1942, every major engagement in the Pacific had ended with Japan advancing and America retreating or absorbing losses. Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, the Java Sea, the Indian Ocean. Even the Battle of Coral Sea, which stopped the Japanese invasion of Port Moresby and counts as a strategic American victory, cost the United States Lexington and left Yorktown so damaged that Pearl Harbor estimated 90 days of repairs. The pattern of the first 6 months of the Pacific War was American resilience absorbing Japanese initiative, a country taking punches while it figured out how to throw them back. Midway broke that pattern, and it never resumed. Japan never launched another major offensive operation in the Pacific after June 1942. Every subsequent Japanese action was defensive and reactive, responding to American moves rather than creating its own opportunities. And the island-hopping campaign that took American forces from Guadalcanal to Tarawa to Saipan to Iwo Jima to Okinawa, each island closer to the Japanese home islands, each battle more costly than the last, traced its origin directly to the 5 minutes on June 4th, when 3 Japanese carriers stopped being warships. The industrial dimension of what Midway decided is difficult to overstate. Japan entered the war with 6 fleet carriers and a naval aviation establishment that had spent years training pilots to a standard no other navy could match. Midway destroyed 4 of those carriers and killed a concentration of experienced aviators representing the accumulated expertise of that training program. The 2 carriers that survived Midway, Shokaku and Zuikaku, both recovering from Coral Sea damage at the time of the battle, would fight on through 1944 before being sunk. And throughout that period, Japan struggled to provide them with air crews whose skill matched the men lost at Midway. The American side of the same equation told a completely different story. Essex-class fleet carriers had been ordered in 1940 and were building in American shipyards throughout the period of Japanese success in 1941 and 1942, and at a pace the Japanese shipbuilding industry couldn't approach. By the time the naval war reached its climactic battles in 1944, the United States had more carrier tonnage than Japan had ever possessed at its peak, crewed by pilots trained in a system producing aviators faster than combat was consuming them. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, sometimes called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, saw American carrier pilots destroy hundreds of Japanese aircraft in a single day against minimal losses, an outcome reflecting 2 years of diverging industrial and training trajectories that began the moment Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu started burning on the morning of June 4th, 1942. Yamamoto had understood this dynamic before the war started and built his entire strategy around avoiding it. The Pearl Harbor was supposed to cripple the American Pacific Fleet so completely that the United States couldn't project meaningful force in the Pacific, while Japan consolidated its empire and established defensive positions strong enough to make reconquest prohibitively costly. What Pearl Harbor actually did was destroy 8 battleships already obsolete in a war that would be decided by carriers and aircraft, while leaving intact the 3 American carriers that happened to be at sea that morning. Those carriers were the foundation on which Nimitz built his Midway defense, and the codebreakers who read Japanese communications were the intelligence layer that turned a numerical disadvantage into a positional advantage. The narrow margins that decided Midway have been analyzed by military historians for more than 80 years. And the analysis keeps producing the same conclusion. The battle rested on a sequence of individual decisions, mechanical accidents, and timing coincidences, any one of which, if reversed, might have changed everything. Tone's float plane launched 30 minutes late because of a catapult malfunction, and those 30 minutes compressed Nagumo's decision window at the worst possible moment. McCluskey spotted Arashi's wake at the moment his fuel calculations were telling him to turn back, and if he had turned back 5 minutes earlier, his dive bombers would have returned to Enterprise without finding the Japanese fleet. 1,400 workers fixed Yorktown in 48 hours, and if Pearl Harbor had given her the 90-day estimate the damage actually required, she would have been in dry dock during the battle, and Japanese intelligence would have been right about there being only 2 American carriers. The Torpedo Squadron's failure was what made the dive bombers' success possible, and nobody planned it that way. Waldron led VT-8 into the killing ground without fighter escort, knowing what he was flying into, because attacking the Japanese carriers regardless of consequences was what his orders required and what his understanding of the battle's importance demanded. The men of VT-8 didn't sacrifice themselves as a deliberate tactical maneuver to pull Japanese fighters to sea level. They attacked because attacking was their mission, and they were shot down because their aircraft were outclassed and they had no protection. The effect of their deaths on the battle's outcome was a consequence of their courage, not a plan anyone had made, and that distinction matters because it captures something true about how battles are actually won and lost, which is rarely the way the clean narrative of strategic execution makes it appear afterward. Midway was won by a codebreaker working in a bathrobe who was right when official Washington said he was wrong, won by an admiral who told his repair crews to do in 48 hours what normally took 90 days, and by workers who actually did it. Won by a torpedo squadron commander who found the Japanese fleet when better-equipped groups didn't, and attacked it knowing his planes were obsolete and his crews unprotected. Won by a dive bomber commander who spotted a destroyer's wake and followed it on instinct when logic said, turn around. Won by pilots flying their first combat missions who held their dives long enough to put bombs through Japanese flight decks. Lost by a Japanese admiral who divided a fleet so large that its individual components couldn't support each other, who relied on intelligence about American carrier positions that turned out to be completely wrong, and whose carriers went into battle without the radar that might have given them enough warning to get fighters to altitude before the American dive bombers arrived. Lost in a hangar deck, where bombs and torpedoes were stacked in the wrong places because the rearming process had been reversed twice under pressure, and there wasn't time to store the weapons correctly. Lost by experienced fighter pilots who had spent 2 hours defending against torpedo attacks and were low on fuel and ammunition and altitude when the dive bombers came from above. 5 minutes between 10:22 and 10:27 on the morning of June 4th, 1942, are described by naval historians as the most decisive 5 minutes in Pacific naval warfare, and the description is accurate in the narrowest tactical sense. But what those 5 minutes actually represented was the convergence of everything that had been building since December 7th, 1941. The months of work in Rochefort's basement, the 48 hours of workers swarming over Yorktown and Dry Dock, the weeks of positioning that Nimitz had done with intelligence Yamamoto didn't know he'd given away. The courage of 3 torpedo squadrons that accomplished nothing measurable and everything necessary. The instinct of a dive bomber commander following a destroyer's wake across an empty ocean. All of it compressed into 5 minutes of dauntless pilots pushing over into their dives above the most powerful carrier fleet Japan had ever assembled. 3 carriers in 5 minutes, a 4th before nightfall. The most powerful naval striking force in the Pacific reduced to 4 columns of smoke visible from 30 miles in every direction. Midway Atoll was designated the Battle of Midway National Memorial on September 13th, 2000. A recognition that arrived 58 years after the battle, long after most of the men who fought it were gone. Tinker Air Force Base outside Oklahoma City was named for Major General Clarence Tinker, who led a bomber strike from Hawaii against the retreating Japanese on June 7th and was killed when his aircraft went down over the ocean. Robert Ballard located Yorktown in May 1998 at 16,650 feet in the Pacific, sitting intact on the bottom, with her flight deck markings still visible, looking less like a wreck than like a ship that had been carefully set down rather than sunk. The Japanese carriers have never been found, resting somewhere on the floor of the Pacific in waters too deep and too scattered for the expeditions that have searched for them, taking the physical evidence of what happened on their hangar decks on the morning of June 4th down with them permanently. George Gay lived until 1994, long enough to see Midway recognized as the turning point it was, long enough to give hundreds of interviews and attend dozens of commemorations and tell the story of Torpedo Squadron 8 to audiences that grew progressively younger relative to him as the decades passed. He never stopped feeling the weight of being the one who came back, and he never stopped talking about the 29 men who didn't. Herman Wouk, who won the Pulitzer Prize for the Caine Mutiny and spent years researching the Pacific War, called the men of Torpedo 8 the soul of America in action, and the description earned its permanence by being exactly right. Not because dying for a mission that failed in every measurable tactical sense is inherently noble, but because those men knew what they were flying into, understood that their aircraft were obsolete and their torpedoes unreliable. And attacked anyway, because the battle required it, and because the alternative was leaving the carriers unattacked, while the dive bombers tried to find them in an empty ocean. The Pacific War that followed Midway lasted 3 more years and cost hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides, ending with atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because the combination of Japanese military culture and geographic defensibility made conventional invasion of the home islands a prospect so costly in human lives that the alternative, however devastating, was chosen instead. The road from Midway to Hiroshima ran through Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, through battles that were in some cases larger and in some cases bloodier than the battle that made them possible. Yet none of them would have happened without June 4th, 1942. Japan's capacity for Pacific-wide offensive operations ended that day on the floor of the ocean northwest of a 2-square-mile atoll that most of the people who fought over it had never heard of before. The spring of 1942, and the trajectory of the entire war in the Pacific and the shape of the post-war world that emerged from it was decided by a sequence of accidents and decisions and acts of courage that compressed into 5 minutes of American dive bombers, finding Japanese carriers with their guards down and their flight decks full. 5 minutes. 4 carriers. 1 turning point. The Pacific War never looked the same again, because after June 4th, 1942, it wasn't.